He attended poetry readings and met a drunken Jack Kerouac, while across the US the public were being introduced to the first published works from these beat writers.
The first thing that appeared was Allen Ginsberg's Howl, which was like a trip to the moon for America at the time, because Ginsberg totally violated the entire literary protocol as it had existed since maybe Christopher Smart, but Smart was writing in an insane asylum, nobody read him. So Ginsberg is the first signal to the literate public that something very new is happening. When Ginsberg reads this poem in '55 in San Francisco, it is reported 3 days later in the New York Times. The Times doesn't usually concern itself with poetry readings in dirt floor art galleries in San Francisco. That's not their beat. That's not their turf. But this was written up because it was a new sound. And, of course, the content of what Ginsberg was writing and the lack of self-censorship was also, I mean, he was violating major taboos as they had existed in Western literature for hundreds of years in that poem.
I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix.
On the Road comes out in '57. After a 6-year period when it was considered unpublishable, mostly because Kerouac refused to castrate the novel and make the editorial changes to conventionalize his manuscript. When he finally gives up and lets them do it, he says he can't do it because God dictated it to him, and to revise would be blasphemous. On the Road is greeted by Gilbert Milstein in the New York Times as the reviewer who compares it to Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises and says this is the voice of a new generation.
The kind of idea of freedom and an idea of pursuing the artistic vocation of being a writer in ways that were not bound by the polite conventionalities of what it meant to be, quote-unquote, a poet.
And not only did Kerouac and the Beats redefine Cohen's conception of what a poet could be, they also laid the groundwork, along with one of their influences, Arthur Miller, for a new kind of novel. Many stylistic traits in Kerouac's On the Road, with its radical stream of consciousness prose style, were evidently influential upon Cohen's groundbreaking experimental second novel, Beautiful Losers. Like the work of the Beats before it, upon its release in 1966, this book was hailed by some as a masterpiece, although it scandalized many in the conservative literary establishment.
Both On the Road and Beautiful Losers were challenging books that threatened the establishment. I do think that there's intersections between Kerouac and Cohen as prose writers. I think one of those intersections is intensity and that sense of the free-flowing consciousness of creativity. How's that for overstating it? But you know that Kerouac wrote On the Road on a single sheet of paper, on a roll, and because he didn't want to break the flow by having to replace sheets of paper in a typewriter. Leonard kind of did the same thing, but it was more his state of mind, brought on by drugs, brought on by sunstroke, brought on by drink, you know, in this 2 periods of really intense writing, out of which comes Beautiful Losers. And I think you can sense that when you read the book, because it's not your, it's not a novel that's under control, as On the Road is not a novel under control. These are blasts, bursts of energy.
We are now in the heart of the last feature in the System Theater. Within severe limits, like smoke in a chimney, the dusty projection beam above our hair twisted and changed. Like crystals rioting in a test tube suspension, the unstable ray changed and changed in its black confinement. Like battalions of sabotaged parachutists falling from the training tower straight down in various contortions, the frames streamed at the screen, splashing into contrast color as they hit, just as the bursting cocoons of Arctic camouflage spread colorful organic contents over the snow as the divers disintegrate one after the other. No, it was more like a ghostly white snake sealed in an immense telescope. It was a serpent swimming home, lazily occupying the entire sewer which irrigated the auditorium. It was the first snake in the shadows of the original garden, the albino orchard snake, offering our female memory the taste of everything.
It's more a question of outlook than it is style. Look, this novel is much more philosophical than Kerouac usually is. Miller is the philosophical novelist, perhaps the most philosophical novelist. Now, I have to point out, pedantically, that this is the most dangerous route for any novelist to take. If you write about sex, your readers will love it. They'll read it. They'll be rooted to the page. If you write about ideas, they will fall asleep on you. He wonders, his narrator, Cohen, wonders, the narrator wonders, does God love us? That kind of metaphysical question, you know, is so pronounced in Cohen. Now, it's there in Kerouac, too. God is very present, even in On the Road. It's anomalous in American literature at the time, because remember, World War II had occurred. The Holocaust had occurred. It wasn't fashionable to talk about God. God didn't prevent this, you know? It wasn't fashionable in the literary community. Kerouac has God-like figures, prophetic figures appearing all through On the Road. So, I mean, it's very hard to say this is Kerouac, this is Miller, you know. What we can see is this affinity, this spiritual affinity, which is greater than the stylistic affinity that Cohen has.
If Cohen's Beautiful Losers shared an affinity with Kerouac's prose, it also drew upon the work of the more secluded and sinister beat writer, William Burroughs, whose key work did not appear until the end of the 1950s, and who was initially far less celebrated than his fellow scribes.
Naked Lunch also has tremendous controversy around it, although it's a much more difficult text. I think that, too, has a profound impact on Leonard Cohen as a